Hello, my name is Melanie Noronha. I'm a senior manager for policy and insights at Economist Impact, and I'll be your moderator today for today's discussion on sorting plastic waste, taking the onus off the consumer. Now, well sorted plastic waste significantly improves the economics of plastic recycling, particularly as the system stands today. Reducing impurities by ensuring it's not mixed with other types of waste, such as residual food waste, improves the overall quality of the waste stream, and thus the quality of the recycled output. Ensuring the consistency of the waste stream by segregating different types of plastic can also improve recycling outcomes. So, sorting is absolutely critical to the success of a recycling process. But sorting is plagued with issues, starting from the types of plastic packaging materials used to improper sorting by consumers. Now, understanding consumer behavior is a critical step in designing an effective recycling system. There's also the evolution in labeling, in recycling technologies that are also helping us to take the onus off the consumer. Now, maybe this is not needed, but we want to hear a lot more on this topic from our panelists today. And joining us today are three distinguished panelists. And we have with us today Lars Mortensen, circular economy, consumption and production expert at the European Environment Agency. We have Lenneke Schills, Global Insights Director at GFK. And we have Maria Westerbos, founder and director of the Plastic Soup Foundation. A warm welcome to our panelists. And we have less than 30 minutes, so I'm really keen to jump in right into the discussion. I'd like to structure this discussion mainly into two parts. So the first half, focusing a little bit more on the consumer and sorting behavior, and the second maybe on the enabling environment, some regulation and technologies, but of course only if we have time. So to start off with, in terms of consumer and sorting behavior, Maria, I want to come to you first. So maybe help to set the scene a little bit for us. Why is sorting so important? What are some of the challenges with sorting plastic waste at waste management facilities? Why are we focusing so much on sorting?
Well, I think what's very important about sorting is the awareness of consumers. If you start sorting out your plastic waste, you see how much plastic you're using and how little other waste you have in your trash bin. So I would say that's the most important thing of it. By the way, in Holland, we are doing something very strange. We started sorting out, very good. Consumers were very happy with that. But recently we stopped with it again because they say the sorting machines of waste facilitators are doing better than we do as consumers. So we throw everything again in a trash bin, just like that. I'm very sorry about that.
No, that I think the problem of too much waste is definitely a challenge. And Lenek, I want to continue that conversation with you. So sorting, of course, starts with the consumer and their knowledge of recycling and their commitment to sorting correctly as well. Are there any challenges with this, with the consumer? Do we care too little to sort properly, or are we throwing out too much?
I definitely can vouch that it is not about caring too little. I think there is unprecedented momentum at the time of consumers across the globe, basically, to really uh, care about environmental issues and to take actions accordingly. And this has concentrated very much so on packaging and plastic waste. We do see a bit of a, I would say, shift in focus towards the bigger issue of climate change and towards more circularity. Um, but still, packaging is very much, I would say, at the forefront of this attention of consumers. So the willingness is definitely there. However, sometimes what we do find is, especially when it comes to sorting, to answer more concretely your question, um, it is about either people sorting too much or throwing in too much, wish cycling, as we say. They're not sure about how or what should go in, so they throw in more than they should. So great, I think, as Maria said, for awareness, not so great in the end for sorting. And on the other hand, I think proper labeling is a big challenge, because we are seeing that most consumers say it's difficult to find recycling labels. And especially in Latin America and Asia, we do see that people have more trouble of understanding at all what they can recycle at their own home. So it's not about the willingness, but it's more about the ease and information, I would say.
Those are fantastic points, Lenik. I completely agree with that. I think it's definitely about making it a little easier for the consumer, giving them a little bit of guidance. And I do want to delve into that labeling topic a little later in this discussion. But Lars, I'll come to you. I think when we were talking before, you were also, very strong. Had a strong commitment, or sorry, you had a strong position that consumers are very committed to recycling. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that. But then also, if we can hear a little bit more also about deposit return schemes and how effective they are in this system.
Yes, thanks very much, Melanie. Indeed, our experience is that consumers are really willing to sort if they have the knowledge to do so. I think the deposit return systems that are used to return bottles of glass and plastic are used in many countries and are very, very effective. It is a really, really good example of one type of plastics where many countries have return rates of over 90%. So 90% actually comes back and is recycled. So I think this could be expanded to more countries, and the model, of course, also includes finance, getting money back from your bottles. So I think there's a potential to see how can you look into expanding that to other types of plastics. But of course, that is not easy because PET, from which it's made of, is very valuable, and other types of plastics is not. But I think the willingness to uh, to sort is really something that we see across Europe where I work. So we can actually use that to get people to sort the waste, the plastic fraction really well, and use that as a basis to deal with the other types of plastics as well.
That's really great. So 90% return rate on PET bottles, is that right? So that's fantastic and really shows the effectiveness of a scheme like that. Again, expanding it will definitely be an interesting proposition. Lenica, I want to also come to you about um, maybe something a little bit more on those packaging materials. Now, sorting would be easier and more economical if all packaging materials were recyclable, right? And this starts with consumers' purchasing decisions. So, from your research and your experience, how much is packaging a differentiator here when making a purchase? So, do you think consumers will be willing to pay a little bit more if they see an eco benefit or if they see that the packaging is recyclable in a product?
Yeah, thanks, Melanie, for that question. I think packaging is a huge differentiator. As I just said, lots of focus on plastic. So actually, we see loads of consumers, especially in Europe, where eco activism, as we might dub it, is the highest, actually moving away from plastic to other types of materials. So there is also an increased uh, awareness and willingness to act to make different types of purchase decisions. So by example, for example, in Germany, in just 1 year, we've seen value shares of plastic bottles in soft drinks fall with 6%, major shift to other types of formats. So it is a differentiator, and people are focusing a lot on what it is packed in. It's also one of the main things consumers actually look for when they check labels. Um, Many people, most people check labels for environmental recycling information, and also here how to recycle instructions, kind of whether the product is packaged in recyclable materials or whether it will be recycled afterwards, are top things people actually focus on when checking labels. So it is a key differentiator, and it's also a key influencer, I would say, in making that sustainable choice. Um, Plastic bottles and bags are still perceived as being the most polluting, way more than cardboard or aluminum. It's hardly mentioned by shoppers. So I think keeping all of that in mind is quite important. But when you come to the willingness to pay, this is always a quite difficult discussion, I would say, because it's so much linked to the perceived value, the functionality of the product, and quite frankly, also I would say one's dedication. So yes, we are seeing a huge growing cohort of eco-active shoppers across the world, especially in Europe. But there's also an even larger segment of shoppers that do care but are not really there to take action yet, and their major obstacle to taking that action is affordability. So whereas there is many shoppers that are willing to either shift their purchasing from one product to the other because of better packaging, there is also a huge cohort that's just not really, yeah, as involved in this discussion, or definitely not willing to pay. On the opposite, it's often, I would say, perceived as being more expensive, and this is a huge obstacle to actually making that purchase decision. So yeah, and these return schemes, I think, work quite well because it's more of a positive sentiment when you get money back for something that you have purchased. And I do think it works that well because combining the green motive with a financial motive is really, really key to also get those more skeptical consumers into nudging them into behaviors that actually are doing good for the environment. And just one example as a final comment on this. Yesterday, I live in the Netherlands as well. I was waiting on the streets, getting a coffee actually, and I saw um, the waste being picked up in the streets, and then they actually stopped from the municipal waste collection organization. They have little cars. They stopped and took out all the little PET bottles, took them to a bin. So they actually were putting them back in the bin, but this bin has a ring around it where you can put those little bottles and people can collect them that are more in need of money, and they can bring them back to these collection systems. So they serve two purposes. It's being brought then to the place it should be, but it's also helping people in need to be able to collect those bottles and actually make some money whilst doing so. So I thought that was a great example of how you can combine different motives and nudging into great behaviors.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think as we're thinking about consumer behavior, which is incentivizing, is a really important element as opposed to talking about maybe increases in price due to more expensive packaging. But that's also a perception, right? I think there's more in terms of the economics of assessing the economics around that. Maria, I want to come to you to continue this conversation on packaging, but sort of moving now into our second segment of that enabling environment a little bit. In my previous discussion, say for the World Ocean Summit, we talked a lot about standardizing plastic packaging. Do you think regulators should do that to standardize plastic packaging so that it simplifies sorting, given our focus on sorting for this discussion, or do you think that will stifle packaging innovation? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I do think that there are by now 150,000 types of plastic, and the industry keeps on patenting new types of plastic to make it unique. And we cannot standardize that. That's impossible. Of course, you have PET, you have PPVC, and if we segment that a little bit more, it's also a matter of how much additives are in there. And I don't want to be too negative, but you cannot standardize that. I would say we need to simplify the plastics, so less additives, less types of plastic, and on the other end, refill and reuse plastics much more. And then in the end, if that's not possible, it's a matter of recycling. So I think it's very hard to standardize it.
That's really interesting, and thank you for sharing your perspective on that. Definitely about simplifying the types of plastics. Maybe that's one approach for sure. And of course, we are talking about sorting and recycling in the broader context of other initiatives that need to be done, refilling and reuse as well. So completely agree with that. Lenaka, I want to come to you about a point you made about labeling earlier as well. Maybe if you can briefly touch on that. I do want to go to Lars as well with a couple of questions about some of this enabling environment. But briefly, if you can tell us a little bit more about will better labeling enable sorting, and then should that be regulated or should that be standardized in terms of maybe providing clearer instructions to consumers to enable better sorting?
Yes, I think there's a great need and a bit of a gap when it comes to the information being relayed on consumers, because as I just mentioned, recycling labels is the top thing looks for by consumers on packaging, but they also state, I think more than 40% say, yeah, it's sometimes I can't find them, I don't know where to look for them. And especially when I think in this area of consumer goods, fast moving consumer goods, and just picture yourself in a supermarket, and there's about 100 decisions you're making, and you want to be out of there sometimes as fast as you can. So you're really not gonna, you know take the time for every single one of those decisions you're gonna make to try and find that information, to try and look for that information, uh, discover alternatives, what is the best. So it's also about really simplifying the choice. And then, yes, I guess standardizing labeling in that sense might really work. We're seeing huge effort across Europe with Nutri-Score at this moment, in trying to I would say support healthy behaviors with all its flaws and benefits. But it is a major effort that has been done across many countries, and manufacturers buying into this. So it is possible to make collective change also on packaging, with on pack information, on easing the choice. And you'll never please everyone, because there's lots of discussion on this system as well. But I do think more on-pack information that is easily understood will really help. And I think there's quite some innovations going on in this area as well. Like I know about a project, the Holy Grail project, with digital watermarks, where actually consumers don't really have to be bothered by investigating themselves so much. It's the watermark that really enables efficient sorting on site. So I do think it really would pay off to look into these kind of solutions as well, definitely, as we move
Great.
forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that and for that example as well. Lars, I want your thoughts on all of this in terms of labeling to enable better sorting. I know earlier we were talking at a slightly different perspective, but please do share your thoughts on labeling to improve sorting.
I think labeling is, of course, very, very important. Should be aware, though, that labeling is providing information, and we know that some consumers react to that, and others don't. So labels will not solve the whole problem. I think I have to come back to the issue of plastics. That plastic, it is a whole system of plastics that we need to look at, the production and the consumption of plastics. At the moment, the production and consumption of plastics increases year by year. So does the CO2 emissions from plastics, so does the microplastics, so does the marine litter. So we need to look at that whole picture, and we cannot solve that by providing labels to the consumers. So I think the companies producing plastics have a big responsibility. The retailers selling the packaging have a big responsibility. They need to look at, well, does fruit and vegetables, does it need to have packaging? They have to take a responsibility for that whole thing. And then the policymakers also need to come in and say, listen, okay, what can we do to make sure that this system changes? That this is not a linear system, that this becomes a circular system where, of course, we recycle plastics when we have to, the best possible way. But the most important is to avoid the excess use of plastics and to prevent plastic waste for coming into the system overall. So there's lots to be done in that as well. For example, designing better products, designing products that don't need as much packaging. So there's a whole thing to go in there to change the whole system. And I would like to point to that because I think that's really critical with the effects of plastics on climate and on the environment increasing year by year.
Yeah, thank you again for reminding. I think that this is a broader system change and that it just is not narrowly focused, or we should not only emphasize on recycling. But just a quick point as well, just as we're talking about recycling and sorting, the Economist Impact actually just published some research on advanced plastic recycling technologies, and there are some that are able to process mixed waste streams. So once again, the need for sorting reduces a little bit there. What are your thoughts on that, Lars? Is that something that the community is talking about, that regulators are recognizing? What's the thinking there?
Yes, that's something. There's a lot of discussion about that out there right now about mechanical recycling as well as chemical recycling. What we see is that there's a lot of innovation happening. A lot of it is small scale and needs to be scaled a lot. And more knowledge, there's no more knowledge needed, especially, for example, on the chemical recycling, which has some advantages, but also other disadvantages, for example, very high energy use. So we really need to look much more into that to see how, and that brings me back to the issue that if we avoid plastic ending in the system in the first place, that means that we have to focus less on that. And to be honest, what is happening is that a lot of the richer parts of the world have been exporting a lot of the plastic waste. And we're doing that less now with this being part of a UN convention that we can't do that anymore. So we have to handle the plastic waste. And the systems are still not yet in place. So a lot of investments are actually needed. A lot of support is needed for these technologies, all these startups to basically to do much better. So it's a big challenge we have before us to do better on that.
Absolutely. And again, it'll be interesting to see how these technologies evolve and how it changes some of the decision making. Maria, I wanted to get your thoughts as well on some of that's been discussed here. Again, possibly, in terms of either in terms of labeling, of course, you talked about plastic packaging, and that's not possible, but maybe in terms also of incentivizing the consumer, right? I think that was a great point that Lenneke raised earlier. But how do we do some of that? How do we incentivize better consumer behavior to enable sorting?
Well, I do think that if you start labeling for consumers, what does a consumer do? Can he put PVC in another box than PLA or than PET? That's impossible. So I would say that we really need to simplify plastic in itself and find other ways of. We need to find a plastic that's no plastic. For example, Xampla, and by now a scale up from Oxford University, did find, based on spider webs, a plastic that's no plastic, that is fully biodegradable. And I think that's what the consumer is looking for. And if we can scale that up, you can just put it out with your compost in your garden. And as long as plastic is something that never goes away, I fully agree with Lars that it's even very hard to make it a circular economy. If you look at your clothes, your garments, it's just if you rinse your clothes, it's already shedding fibers. So it's out there in the air. It's out there in the air you breathe, in the water you drink, in the apple you eat. So less plastic, I would say, and fully biodegradable plastics, new ways of thinking, and new ways of producing. That would be my mantra.
That's great. Lars, you raised your hand. Do you have a comment as
Yes,
well?
I wanted to come in on this on bioplastics because that's another big discussion. So of course, biodegradable plastic is can be part of the solution, but the consumers are not aware that biodegradable plastics do not necessarily biodegrade by themselves, but only on a certain temperature. So we have to be very careful with that, and also with the fact that bio-based plastics is different from biodegradable plastics. So we have to operate with all of these, but be very careful with how we do that because it's very very confusing for the consumers, I would say.
But Lars, that's not
What?
what I'm saying. I'm not saying that it's I am talking about complete new types of plastic. I'm not talking about PLA or biodegradable I am talking about innovations that goes much further than that. So you cannot do it with mixed streams. I fully agree with that.
Okay, thanks.
And
Good to hear.
and is this again, Maria, just to follow up on that, is that then to ensure that we're using just a similar or simplified types of materials that don't require as extensive sorting as is required today?
Yeah, but in the end, if you cannot put all these plastics together, so in the end, it's chemical or mechanical recycling. We have very much you can hardly sort things out that have been out there already. And we have a very good waste management system in Holland, for example. But even in Italy, it's getting worse, or in Turkey, or like in England, there's a lot of landfill, and there is not so much incinerators. We in Holland we have 200 incinerators. We import waste to burn it for other countries, and we are building chemical recycling units to burn even more or recycle more waste from other countries. So we are traders in Holland, and we trade in trash. So we're very good in that also. So the discussion is as we started with, it's extremely difficult, but it's more something for producers, and in the end, the push factor of the retailers than consumers. The consumers cannot do too much. The plastic is a push factor and not a pull factor. Consumer is not in the supermarket and shouting, "I want more plastic, give me more plastic." No, the consumer says, "Give me less plastic."
Right. Okay, fantastic. Thanks for that, Maria. We are running out of time, but Lenaka, I just wanted to come. You raised your hand earlier. I want to come to you for a
Mm.
final comment on this. And again, I think we've been talking a lot about, the session is titled Taking the Onus Off the Consumer. And is that a goal to work towards?
Well, I can only I would say stand beside Maria's last words. That the consumers are not in the stores shouting, "Give me more plastic." They definitely want less plastic, and they are doing what are not all consumers obviously, but an increasing amount of consumers is doing what they think they can, and it's most easy for them to understand on how to pitch in solving these major environmental problems we're facing. So it's shifting away from plastic, it is trying to recycle, to wish cycle, it is trying to reduce it, eating meat, trying to refill, trying to reuse, making do it yourself uh, fixes. But yeah, it's not enough because our lifestyle demands are also increasing into a direction where there's an increased need for convenience. And last 2 years of pandemic has also increased our demand for takeout dinners, for example. So the amount of plastic you'll see there, and this is often non-recyclable plastic, has increased hugely. So I do think consumer demand is the ultimate measure, especially what's happening at the point of sale, of how well certain measures are being adopted or not. So taking the onus of the consumer is definitely important, because what happens there will decide what way it's going to swing. But it is the input and the strength of, I would say, multi-stakeholder efforts here that can help the consumer in really making that final choice and the better choice. Because the willingness is there, but the affordability, the ease, and the knowledge sometimes is lacking.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lenika. I think that was a brilliant way to wrap up this discussion. Again, it's a small segment, it's a small part of a much broader discussion on managing plastic waste. I think starting with points that were repeated throughout this discussion about changing the mindset and changing the system as a whole, reducing our production and consumption of plastic to begin with. But then also recognizing that consumers are committed to reducing the amount of plastic they're consuming, and that retailers must provide more options and more information as well, in terms of not just making the right purchasing decisions, but also with sorting. There will be technologies, there will be evolution in technologies, whether the digital watermark, whether advanced recycling technologies that may ease the burden a little bit more in the future, but we'll have to wait and see with some of them. But thank you so much to our panelists today for joining here and sharing their perspective. Thank you to our audience for listening in. Please stay tuned for the next session at the Sustainability Week.